Hi everyone, my name's Tom Haynes and I'm from Perform Motion. Today what I want to be talking about is go over a bit over squats and what happens with the squats when people come out of the hole. So there's usually like two kinds of squats that you'll see people do when they're like lifting maximal loads. You'll see the first kind where someone kind of just looks like their whole body is moving as a unit to come out of the squat. It looks very fluid, it looks very effortless, it looks fast, and it doesn't look like there's any part of the body that's kind of fighting to get itself up to the top position. Then on the other hand, you'll see a different kind of squat where someone comes out of a hole, their knees start to dive together, they start to slow down in velocity, it looks like the lift gets harder, and generally the lifter starts to shift around in terms of where their balance is or where their center of mass is. So today I want to talk about that, why we think that occurs, and some ways that we can go around both understand the concepts behind it and ways you can fix it, or at least start to address it in the long run. So for a long time, it was thought that if the knees came in during that aspect of the squat, or sort of around that 90 degrees position in a squat, sort of what I've drawn here roughly from the front on position, is that it was the adductors' fault. The adductors were too tight or they were too strong and they were pulling the knees together in so that you kind of get to a position where you were in like a disadvantageous position to keep standing up with the barbell on your back. What we found through a better understanding of human biomechanics, human anatomy, and just more time with the research is that we've found that it's not actually the adductors' fault. It's more so the adductors are trying to save that squat. And I want to kind of use today to talk about why we think that's happening. So kind of like I was saying before, we've got those two kinds of squats that you find. The one that looks effortless, and then the one we're talking about just before where the knees start to dive in. So ideally, we want to be trying to strive to get a squat that looks effortless or feels really strong and feels like a whole body is moving as a unit to do it. So depending on which lift you watch, sometimes it'll look like their knees don't move at all and everything just looks like it's moving up. Other lifters, you might see that their knees actually look like they're pushing out. Other lifters look like their knees are actually pushing in. So you'll see like a wide range of different kind of presentations in that squat. But it can be quite tricky and almost like I suppose, not confusing, but almost deceptive in what's happening there. Because each of those lifters has like a different way that they're kind of cueing or controlling their knees down, they have a fundamental difference in what's happening in their pelvis. So their pelvis is allowing the whole body to kind of transfer a lot of that force from the lower body into the squat. And it sounds like a little bit strange, but that's what I want to talk about now. I've got this like little drawing on this little caricature of a person inside here with a diaphragm. So if you look at the two diaphragms here, we've got one underneath the rib cage, which is like our main one where we breathe, I suppose. It's our main breathing muscle. And then we've got the one underneath, which is the pelvic diaphragm. And that's more like your pelvic floor, I suppose. And generally speaking, when we breathe in, both diaphragms will work together. Like they'll both, I suppose, contract and create that kind of vacuum to drag air into our lungs. And they'll both move down into the body, like relatively speaking. So like the diaphragm will move down towards the pelvic diaphragm will move down towards the feet in that direction. So apart from contracting and creating a vacuum for the air to kind of like push or like pull into the lungs, the other thing that happens is like both these diaphragms move down. So all of our guts inside our body start to move down as well. So this is all our internal organs, a lot of the pressure within like our abdominal cavity. And like it all starts to move down. So what you can imagine is like when both those diaphragms kind of relax, it all starts to move back up again. So if you imagine like every time we're breathing in or breathing out, we've got these guts moving down, guts moving up. And that's kind of the fundamental reason as to why we want the adductors to be contributing more into the squat. So if you've ever started off in a commercial gym or started off before powerlifting, one of the big things that was taught with squatting was breathing in on the way down and breathing out on the way up. And it almost feels kind of natural. It's only once we start putting more weight on the back that we start to find that breathing and bracing felt stronger. We keep our torso more rigid. Didn't feel like we get folded by the barbell. But one of the reasons why that breathing in on the way down, breathing out on the way up felt so natural is because it allowed us to use these diaphragms or use this internal pressure to move up and down with the squat. So if you imagine you're coming down into the squat and you're breathing in, all of those, like the diaphragms and the guts inside our body, are moving in the same direction as we are moving with that squat. And then on the other hand, the exact same thing happens as we come out of the hole. As we breathe out, we get like a contraction of a lot of the ab or oblique musculature, and those two diaphragms start to ascend in our body, or the guts start to move up in our body. So we have everything moving together. It's moving somewhat sort of like I was saying, that ideal squat where the whole body's working as a unit. So if we kind of come back to that knees diving in squat that we were talking about earlier, one of the reasons why the knees are diving in is because the adductors are trying to recapture that kind of pelvic movement. So powerlifters generally tend to move towards being a little bit more stiffer or tighter or more extended through their lower back, just from doing lots of deadlifting, lots of bench press, lots of squatting. It just generally, like, it's the presentation we seem to find that a lot of lifters go into. So the only downside of that is that the stiffer that the torso becomes, the harder it is for the adductors to become used in the squat. And that's mostly because the adductors start to become less leveraged to move the pelvis and contribute to those diaphragms moving when we become stiffer through the torso, and more so become more useful for movements like external rotation. So that can be why you start to feel adductors more on something like a sumo deadlift. So the adductors are a really cool muscle because when we look at their functional anatomies, they do so much. They contribute to like almost every single position or like movement the lower body can do. It just kind of depends on the position of the pelvis. So this is often why you can find that people, like powerlifters in general, they start to get better at bench press, they start to get better at sumo deadlifts or deadlifts in general, but the squat seems to stay. It doesn't seem to move as much. Part of that reason is because the deadlift and the bench press tend to be able to be benefited by a very stiff torso, where the adductors start to move to be better at externally rotating. Whereas the squat's a little bit more the opposite. The squat needs to remain to try and use like the whole body to try and get up out of the hole. And that's why you can see like it's like a last ditch effort of the adductors to try and peel the knees back in around halfway through the squat. So a really good analogy I like to think of it with the adductors or with squatting or even the pelvis in general is it's almost like a rocket ship. So when you see these knees diving in, what they're trying to do is they're trying to open the very bottom of that pelvis, like or open up the pelvic floor in that sense, so that we can almost turn ourselves into a rocket ship. Because if we open up the bottom of our pelvis, it allows us to then actually kind of like be in a position to then breathe out and have our guts push us back up out of the squat. So some people find that like when they are in this position, the knees kind of come in, it helps them for a little bit, but then they all of a sudden get stuck and there's like no more give. And that's sort of where like the body is trying so hard to use those adductors to bring that like the knees in, and therefore use like the knees and the legs as this big lever to open up the pelvis. But a lot of things get in the way, whether that's just the weight being too heavy or our pelvic position kind of stopping us from actually being able to use that kind of like rocket ship analogy. So this is where I suppose we'll go into it a little bit more in future videos, but this is where training a lot of lumbar flexion and a lot of femoral adduction can be quite useful, because it allows the body to recapture that kind of internal rocket ship analogy that I was using, just by trying to bring the body into the position it's craving so much. So if you think about it, like a squat is a flexion exercise. Like as we come down to the squat, our whole body's kind of flexing, like our knees are flexing, our hips are flexing, our lumbar will flex a little bit as well. But naturally, we've been trained to kind of stay away from that position and like almost fear lumbar flexion in a lot of ways. So one of the things we can do is if we start to train it mostly in a position of, like I was saying, femoral adduction, squeezing the legs together and letting the pelvis and the lower back start to round out, we can start to get better at this position. And as we get better at this position in an accessory or a more isolated position, it starts to happen more naturally in the squat. So what you'll start to find is that knees will stop diving in so much. The body will almost feel like squats get a little bit easier. Ankle dorsiflexion can improve. It can be easier to not overhinge the squat to the point where you're almost good morning it on the way back up. There's a lot of signs that you can kind of look for to see that the squat's actually getting better at using like a systemic kind of full body movement rather than just your limbs trying to push a rigid torso up. So I think in future videos, we're going to be talking a little bit more about how spinal flexion and femoral adduction has been viewed over the years, a lot of the research, and how we're starting to move towards now, and some more specific exercises that you can use to get better at it. So yeah, thanks for watching.